Start with a question this morning, if I could do that. Who has influenced your life spiritually more than any other human being? I just want you to think about that for a second. Who has influenced your life spiritually more than any other human being? I think. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I will pay you later for that comment, Cheryl. It's great. Cue any more comments, and we will. Appreciate that very much. Thank you. I want to talk quickly about this word influence. This word influence, as we think about those who've influenced us, is really the capacity to have an effect on the character development or behavior of someone or something. When I was a young teenager, I was kind of a very much of a hands-on type of learner, and I feel like I still am. I just kind of have to do it. I can read about it, and that's one thing, and that's helpful for me. But until I can just kind of jump in and just kind of get my hands dirty and do it, that's really where I think I thrive. But at the same time, I'm pretty much a perfectionist, if you haven't figured that out. And so I like to really read up on things before I dive in to really make sure that I know what I'm doing. But it wasn't always the case. I think as a young person, I definitely had maybe a little more boldness about hopping into projects and trying them before I read up on all of them. I was just like, hey, just give me a tool and let's do this thing together. And so I was excited when we had a family that moved in next door to us when I was just a young kid, probably 12 years of age, a family named Wenzel and Irene. And Wenzel and Irene was just a very cool family that I really began to appreciate. And one of the things that I really liked to appreciate about Wenzel and Irene was the fact that they were, number one, had a cool language. They were from Hungary, spoke Hungarian, and at the same time, I loved the fact that Wenzel had every tool imaginable known to mankind. And so I would often go to Wenzel's garage and just hang out with Wenzel, and he would allow me to kind of play with the tools and get familiar with those tools. And whenever I had a project at home, or at least something that my parents allowed me to do, I would go over to Wenzel's garage and ask him for some advice on what could I do. One particular time I can remember going to Wenzel's house, and I told him that I was doing some drywall repairs. Now, keep in mind that I'm like 12 years of age doing drywall repairs in the house, okay? And so I went over to Wenzel, and I said, hey, I need to borrow a circular saw if I could. And I had never used a circular saw probably in my life, but I was willing to give it a shot. It's just kind of how I worked. And so I asked Wenzel if I could kind of borrow his circular saw for a few moments. And as he's kind of getting things kind of in his garage ready to give them, I think he had an intuition to ask this young, bold apprentice, why do you need a circular saw? And I said, I'm going to cut some drywall to fix a repair in my house. And he said, well, then I have just the tool for you. And he hands me a utility knife. And I said, Vincent, you don't understand. I said, I need to cut some drywall to kind of repair a patch in my house. And he's like, no, you're good. And I want to explain that Wenzel and I had a little bit of this relationship, kind of like Mr. Miyagi and the Karate Kid. I don't know if you remember that movie. Honestly, this is how the relationship worked. It was just kind of, he was just like, yeah, you'll do this, and then you'll do this, right? Every time I need to know how to do something, I would go over to Wenzel's house. I'd kind of knock on his door, and the garage would come up, and we would spend some time together in the garage, and he would help me to understand, how to make these tools work. And so that day, he handed me a utility knife, and I looked at him like he was crazy, and I'm like, you don't understand, Wenzel. I'm cutting drywall. And he's like, let me show you. So then Wenzel came over to my house. I already had all of my saw horses set up to make this major cut with the circular saw of my drywall. And I'm glad that Wenzel stopped me in time before I, number one, ruined the blade of a circular saw, number two, seriously injured myself trying to cut drywall with a circular saw. And Wenzel then came next to me, and he grabbed this little utility knife, and he simply made a score across a line that I had already made with a pencil. And then like magic, he went poof. He popped the drywall, literally scored the other side, and I had an absolute perfect cut, and my jaw dropped. What is going on? And from that day on, I would seek out Wenzel and his help whenever I had any kind of a project. I really will never forget Wenzel because of the help that he helped me. And I would say that Wenzel was an excellent mentor in my life when it came to tools everything tools, anything projects. And the fact that my parents trusted me at age 12 and even under with power tools was quite amazing. And I'm glad that they did, because it really helped me. To this day, I'm very comfortable around tools. You give me a tool and I am there, because I learned at a young age and because I had a mentor who really discipled me and helped me to grow in these new abilities that I was so excited about. And so Lowe's and Home Depot are like my favorite places. I'm just like, that's just where I love to be. I'm at home when I'm in those locations. Some of you understand that, and some of you think I'm crazy. And so I'm very grateful for an older neighbor, probably in his 70s and 80s, throughout that span that we knew him, who literally just poured into my life, helping me to understand power tools, how they work, how they don't work, which ones you should use, which ones you shouldn't use. And I became, I would say, an expert under his tutelage as he kind of helped me to kind of get an understanding of all of these tools. But Wenzel didn't pour into me spiritually. Wenzel poured into me kind of with understanding kind of carpentry and power tools and all those things, which I am grateful for. But Wenzel knew that our family was a Christian, or Christians. Wenzel knew that my dad was a pastor. My dad had conversations with Wenzel and Irene many times, and so they knew where we stood with our faith. And so we helped to encourage them as well as they encouraged us. And if you had to ask me, well, what about who has influenced you spiritually? Who has influenced me, my life, spiritually more than any other human being? Other than Jesus Christ, of course, when he walked along the earth, I didn't have the privilege of knowing him when he was here on earth, but I have the privilege of knowing him now. But who other than Christ has influenced my life, if you were to ask me this question, probably has been my dad. And so my dad was also a pastor, and so early on, we were able to kind of see kind of the pastor's life behind the curtain of what happens behind a pastor's life. And my dad modeled for me and modeled for our family, and I would say modeled for his church, what it looks like to be a true disciple, a true follower of Jesus Christ. And my dad mentored me and modeled for me what it means to be a true follower of Christ in multiple areas of his life, just by doing life with me, sometimes informally, and other times formally, as I would go to him and ask him specific questions that I was dealing with in my life or within my ministry. And so if I could encourage you today, if that person, as you answer this question, who has influenced your life spiritually more than any other human being, who has that person been? I'd like to encourage you today, if that person is still alive, that you might call that person today, or go to their house if they still live close to you, or catch them in church if maybe that's your story, and just get a second to look at that person face to face or on the call voice to voice, and just say, thank you for the ways that you poured into my life that helped me become who I am today as a follower of Jesus Christ. There are many other people that I could thank, many others, but my dad, my parents, thankfully, are two that I can thank. Maybe you never had the privilege of having Christian parents pour into your life like that, but maybe that's been somebody else who's been that person who's poured into your life. And who has influenced your life. When you think of the word influence, it's quite a trendy word in our culture today. In fact, in today's world, we call people influencers, right? If they're on social media, then they are called a social media influencer. It's what they do. They try to influence other people towards a specific way of life or lifestyle or political bend or whatever fad is currently trendy, or maybe they're just trying to promote some kind of a product. And so I want you to know a few things. Number one, here's the truth, is that you are an influencer. That every person in this room has the ability to influence somebody, and might I add that you are influencing people all around you, whether you like it or not. So parents, when you get moody and you lose it, right? You're influencing your kids and your family. When your children watch how you act and react to certain things within your life, you are discipling them and training them in a specific way. Young Padawans, right? And so you are teaching them every day of your life as you rub shoulders, as you eat breakfast, as you do lunch, by your character, your behavior, your values, your decisions, whether you like it or not. All of us influence others around us, intentionally or unintentionally. So you could say we are all influencers. They call them social media influencers because that's what they do, right? They want you to follow them so they can influence you to a specific path. All of us are influencers in some way. And I think it's important to start off this way because as we continue to talk about this idea of discipleship, we want to also kind of talk about what it means. And I believe that there might be many of you who already maybe taken a bit of a backseat approach to this series. You're kind of thinking ahead and you're thinking to yourself and you're like, I really don't have much to offer anybody else. I could probably pretty much promise you that in our church, some of us are kind of having this kind of conversation with yourself. And you're saying, I don't think I could ever disciple somebody. I'm like so far behind the curve. Or I just feel like I haven't been a Christian long enough. And some of that might be true, but don't count yourself out just yet. Maybe some of you are like, I'm just not super strong spiritually, or I have a lot of questions myself. If you come to me, by the way, I have a lot of questions myself still as well. Maybe you don't think you're a very good communicator, or you're too young, or maybe you're too old, and maybe you're like, I don't want to mess someone else's life up, all right? Then great, it's not your role to mess their life up. It's your role to simply share Christ and be an example to them as best as you possibly can. And so all throughout this series, I'm praying that this kind of discipleship will happen in all of our lives, that we will have kind of a change in a perspective, a change in our mindset, and really a renewal in our heart towards other people. And I want to continue to persuade you that really discipleship is not just Pastor Paul's instruction to the Gulfview family, but yet it's Jesus Christ's instruction to every one of his followers. That you are a disciple of Jesus Christ who have been called to make followers of Jesus Christ, to pour your life into the lives of others to help them to become followers of Christ. Last week we learned that the call to discipleship is really it's a call to all of us. Anyone who calls themselves a follower of Jesus is to disciple others to do just that, follow Jesus. We looked at the command that Jesus gave before he left the earth, and his disciples were around him, and he kind of dropped that command for them and for us, and that command continues until the end of time. Matthew 28:18 through 20. If you weren't here last week, that's what we looked at. It's known as kind of the Great Commission that Jesus gives us. He's commissioning us, just like he commissioned his disciples. He's commissioning us as his followers to now go and make new followers. Go and pour into the lives of others, helping them. And so we call this the Great Commission. But sad to say, I would say within many churches, it's been known as the Great Omission. A lot of people kind of use, pastors kind of use these kind of catchy words, and they say, yes, it's the Great Commission that Jesus has commissioned us to do, to go and make disciples. But yet the church, often it's known as the Great Omission. It's the thing that goes missing within a church or missing within our lives because we begin to count ourselves out. We begin to think that maybe this is not a task for me, or I'm just not polished enough as a Christian, or I haven't been a follower of Jesus for very long. And we begin to kind of count ourselves out, and we just simply say, I'll leave that to the experts because I don't want to ruin anybody else's life. And so today, as we continue, we're going to study this, really what I would say is a biblical pattern of discipleship that we see that's laid out for us within the Bible. And I'm going to give you kind of some case studies here, particularly over the next 2 weeks. We're going to look at like two, I would say, major case studies, and there's some small ones within these case studies to help us to learn to develop intentional relationships where you and I can learn to mentor others and to model our faith for others and then multiply followers of Jesus in our life. But today, we're only going to look at one of those examples that we see here that's played out within Scripture as we are learning to make disciples amongst those that we know within our church, within our family, and abroad. And I want you to know that my goal throughout really this short series is not to make you feel guilty. I know often guilt can kind of creep up, and I would imagine that within our services, our two services, that probably that's what some of us are beginning to kind of sense. I just haven't been a Christian long enough, or my life seems to be kind of broken in many places, and maybe you're already kind of counting yourself out. Maybe you're even using the good old excuse of time. I just don't have time to come alongside somebody else and help them to grow in their faith, like maybe somebody has helped you. Or maybe at the same time you're saying, hey, nobody came alongside me. And I would say how sad that is, that nobody has stepped up to come alongside you when you were new in your faith. Imagine if someone had, right? And so this is kind of the series that we're looking at as we look at this discipleship and what it means as we come alongside others and help them. And I think we really want to ask, kind of challenge you with a question today is, am I being faithful to the call of discipleship that Jesus has given me? Am I being faithful to the call of discipleship that Jesus has given me? Maybe you're a newer believer, only within maybe a couple of months or even a couple of weeks, I don't know. Maybe for you need to just kind of study along with somebody else who needs to come help you to grow. And if so, then I would make that evident. And maybe you have a friend who's been a follower of Christ for longer. Maybe you need to invite them to come along and coach you as you're learning to be faithful to the call of discipleship. So last week we started by looking at Jesus kind of as our first case study. And we're going to continue to look at Jesus as this case study as we continue on, because Jesus is the one who really started all of this. And so we looked briefly to Christ's call to discipleship. We studied kind of in detail how it started with these two little words that he kind of left his disciples, and he simply said, hey, follow me. Follow me. And if last week was the what of discipleship, then this week we were beginning to kind of get a little practical and kind of look at the how of discipleship. And so last week was a bit of the what. This week we kind of step into a bit of the how. I just want to remind you here, we kind of looked at this, that a disciple is simply a follower of Jesus Christ. And so if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you've had a moment in your life where you've surrendered your life to him, you've placed your faith and trust in him and in his death and resurrection and what he has done for you, then you are a follower of Jesus Christ. You are a disciple of Christ. And thus, if you are a disciple of Christ, then discipleship is intentionally spending time with someone to help them now learn to follow Jesus. And so hopefully, if the moment that you made a decision to follow Christ, in a perfect world, there should have been others who've stepped into your life to help you to grow in your faith, and they hopefully came alongside you and discipled you. But sad to say, that doesn't happen in everybody's life, but yet the Bible tells us that it should, that there should be people who should come alongside us when we're new in our faith to help disciple us into our new faith. And so discipleship is growing. It's intentionally spending time with someone else so that you can learn specifically how you and I can follow Jesus. So this series is different from what we normally do. Typically, we go through a book study together, which is kind of my preference, or we take a chunk of Scripture, we kind of walk through it together, and there's a fancy term for that. They call it expository preaching. And so for preachers, it kind of goes line by line, verse by verse, and it's kind of my preference for preaching. I prefer that because honestly, it really is just a whole lot more rewarding for me and less stressful for me as well. But this particular series is more topical. Topical can be very frustrating for me, where you probably have noticed I'm losing some hair. Because what happens is I will pull hair out as I'm just, not really, but I'm just giving you an example of how I feel internally, as I'm frustrated trying to figure out, well, where do I go? Because I can't just follow the next verse, but yet it's topical, so I'm kind of grabbing fruit, from multiple places and bringing them together, and it's a lot more painstaking work as I sit at my desk for hours. And so topical preaching is beautiful, but it's also very frustrating for me personally. And so this is more topical, as we will kind of look at several passages today. And so I'm going to make you dizzy because we're not staying in one passage. So this week and next week, you're going to be a bit razzled in the head, and it's okay. Just kind of follow me here. And we're going to look at really a pattern of discipleship that we see that's laid out for us within the Bible. So get ready and buckle up. Today's not as painful as next Sunday, but I'm just kind of slowly ramping up to that. And first, I just kind of want to kind of talk about this kind of word selection for a second, if I could. That Jesus' discipleship strategy had to do with some selection within his life. It was not programs, it wasn't techniques, it wasn't marketing. He didn't send out some marketing ads like, I'm looking for a few good followers, come follow me. He didn't really have to do that because people were naturally drawn to Jesus because of his life, because of his beliefs, because of his teachings, right? And so his strategy, I would say, Jesus' strategy was simply people, mainly working with 12 men who we call the disciples or followers of Jesus Christ, right? He mainly worked and spent most of his time with those 12 disciples. And then last week we learned a little of how Jesus first selected some of those first disciples. Matthew 4 kind of records some of those details for us that we looked at. As Jesus was simply walking along the Sea of Galilee, it says he came across two fishermen, Andrew and Peter. And this is what we looked at last week in Matthew 4:19. And he said to them simply what? Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Kind of makes sense, right? As they're throwing their nets fishing for fish, Jesus says, I'm going to change your occupation for a bit, right? And I'm going to teach you how to fish for people. And so Jesus, his strategy was mainly working or discipling with a close-knit group of 12, a dozen, and then he even narrowed that dozen down to three who were his posse, his group, his three that he spent most of his time with. And so he selected from the 12 three that he's like, these three, I really want to continue to pour a little bit more into their life. And so he selected his first followers or his disciples. John chapter 15, I told him I'm going to make you dizzy. We're not staying in one passage, and so we're going to be all over the map today and next week. And you can make some notes here and kind of go back to these on your own to get fuller context and clarity there. John 15, he says, you did not choose me, but I chose you. And so Jesus goes about choosing his first disciples, those men who he's going to invest his life into their life. Notice what Mark chapter 3 says to us, verses 13 through 19. And he went up to the mountain and called to him those whom he desired, and they came to him, and he appointed how many? 12, whom he also named the apostles. These are also the disciples, they're known as. And so that they might be with him and he might send them out as representatives, you could say, to preach and have authority to cast out demons. He appointed the 12. And here they are. If you ever wonder where they are, maybe you didn't know, but here's the 12 kind of listed in one spot. To whom he gave the name Peter. And so Simon, James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges. That is sons of thunder. Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas and James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus and Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot who betrayed him. It's funny that there's quite a few names in there that maybe you forgot that they were a part of the 12, right? But then he narrowed that 12 down to a specific 3, and those are the ones that we hear most about. Some of those other names, are a little bit off to the edges. We don't hear as much about those other names. That's why if I had to tell you today and kind of give you a quiz, name all 12 disciples, probably 95% of us would strike out, right? Because we can't remember all of those names, and some of them are a little bit tricky. And so Jesus selected or chose, he called those whom he desired to be his first followers. Those to whom he wanted to make disciples. This was his pattern. I love that this is kind of a motley crew, a motley bunch of men that the world probably would have never chosen. They didn't have the degree. They certainly didn't have the pedigree to follow Jesus. They each had their own issues. If you've done any studies of the disciples, then you kind of know what some of their issues were. But Jesus always chooses the unlikely candidates. I love that. So when you think you're too far gone, it's okay, right? So was Paul, right? If you think you were too far gone, it's okay. So were the disciples. But Jesus saw something in them and he chose them to be a part of his team. They all had issues. They all had struggles, but Jesus always chooses the unlikely candidates to be his followers And we would like to use this catchy word, his influencers, as we say today. And together, those 12 literally began to change the world. Minus one who went south, right? They went to change the world. And if you were to study Jesus' strategy for his mission to the world, you would discover that it kind of came down to kind of these 12 disciples. But most of his time, again, was spent discipling simply three. There was a kind of concentric circles, as we kind of seen. It's in his strategy. Think of bullseye. And so he had kind of three that he really spent time with. Then he had like 12 that he also spent time with, but not as focused or strategic. And then the third circle, this concentric circle, was really kind of the masses. And so those that he interacted with as he went about doing his life. And so in the middle here of the bullseye, his closest selected followers were Peter, James, and John, the most that we hear about as we read in the Gospels. Then again, he continues to go out from there. And the last circle being the multitudes or the crowds that always followed him. So this was how kind of Jesus kind of selected some of his followers. Now let's continue to kind of look at this pattern of discipleship. Once he selected them, then what did he do? And we're going to kind of look at kind of three words here. And the first word we're going to look at is this idea of mentor. If you were to follow Jesus' life closely within the gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, then you would see that after Jesus selected the 12, he then spent time with the 12. He mentored them. Just like my neighbor Wenzel, right, mentored me how to use power tools. To this day, I can now mentor other young people on how to hold a power saw, what to do and what not to do, because Wenzel poured into my life, helping me to understand how to hold tools. And so Jesus spent 3 years of his life pouring in, right, to the disciples' life, helping them to become experts at what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And so he selected these 12, spent time with the 12, mentored them, did it constantly. And mentorship, you can't get away from it, but mentorship always requires time spent with another person. Mentorship is always time. So that's one of the things that you can't remove from kind of the beauty of discipleship is that you have to be able to give some time. It doesn't have to be overwhelming, but it has to be some strategic time as you spend and do life on life with another person. If we were to look at Matthew chapter 3, verses 13 and 14, again, we see how Jesus' discipleship pattern began simply with an afternoon with Jesus, time spent with Jesus. Look at the details a little closer here in Mark chapter 3 in Mark's gospel. And Mark says this, and he went up on the mountain and called to him those whom he desired, and they came to him, and he appointed 12, whom he had named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach. Jesus being strategic as what he's doing, as he's meeting with this 12, his purpose is to spend time with them so that he can multiply himself to send them out so that they can also spend time with others. And so it's very strategic to what Jesus was doing here. And so look at this last phrase. He says this. He says, so that they might be with him and he might send them out to preach. There is kind of a definitive order here that Jesus gives. Number one, he says, they're going to be with me. They're going to be with Jesus. So time spent with Jesus as a mentor. And so as you're learning and spending time with Jesus, you're going to be able to grow in your faith to be able to help others and pour into their life and spend time with them to help them follow Jesus. The word mentor means it's a trusted guide or a teacher or an advisor who gives personal or spiritual direction, encouragement, and wisdom. But time, I think, is the component here that's key. You can't mentor someone without spending some time with them. It all comes down to time. My neighbor Wenzel was always willing. He was retired, and so it made his life a little easier. And so, seriously, I would go to his house and just knock on his door, and the garage would go up, right? He knew what that meant. It was time to do life on life. And so we would sit in his garage, and he would kind of share with me different tools and help me to really get my head wrapped around how to use some of these tools. And so I would always go to him with something that I was trying to figure out, and he would spend time with me. You can't get away from that component. It takes time. It takes some energy, but it is energy and time that's well worth it. And so it starts here, as he says here in this verse, so that they might be with him. And so that they might send them out to preach. So first, these disciples are just going to be with Jesus. He takes time to mentor them, to help them understand how to do this. And then secondly, they'll be sent out to preach once he feels like it's time. And before they can preach, they need to be mentored. And so they have to have some quality time with Jesus. And the same is true for us. Before you can really kind of help others to follow Jesus, you first of all have to learn to follow Jesus yourself. And some of you are like, oh, great, well, that's my excuse because I'm still learning. You'll always be learning. I'm still learning. And that's the beauty of it, is that you can come alongside someone else and mentor them to grow in their newfound faith. Maybe you've been a believer for 5 years, 10 years, 15, or 25. You're still learning. You're still growing. And you can tell them that, hey, I'm still learning to follow Jesus, but I'm going to help you learn some things. Let's raise the garage. Come on in. I'll show you some tools. We see this same pattern in the book of Acts with the beginning of the church. Peter and John are kind of boldly and courageously preaching to others. And the Sanhedrin is there. These are, the religious leaders who kind of take note of some cool little detail. And you find out that these religious leaders didn't have it all together. How many of you would say that there's been times when you just feel a bit uneducated? Maybe you feel like a common Christian and you sort of wonder, how could God use me? Anybody ever feel like you're unqualified to be a disciple maker? Yeah, I mean, that's me as well. Sometimes I feel like I'm a bit over my head. And so even his followers kind of felt this way. You're in good company. Notice what Acts records for us about some of Jesus' closest followers in Acts chapter 4. This is the beginning of the church here. Now, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated, this is Peter and John, followers of Jesus, it was perceived to everyone else that they had boldness, but yet they were uneducated, common men. They were astonished. They recognized that they had spent time with Jesus. I love this verse because it gives me hope, and it should give you hope as well. Because don't ever think that you're unqualified or inept for the task of discipleship that Jesus has called you to. So were they. But they simply spent time with Jesus, learned from Jesus, and they were trying to figure out how they can help others. And here they are amongst the learned, right? And it was obvious, right? A few things. It was obvious that they were uneducated. Maybe there was some eloquency that was lacking in their words. They were common men, but at the same time, the other religious leaders were astonished. They were astonished. And they recognized. Why were they astonished? Because they recognized that they were like their disciple maker. They were like the one who they had spent time with. They were like the one who had mentored them. Because a student begins to mimic their teacher. In the Jewish world, within Bible times, and even among Orthodox Jews today, if you were to travel to Israel, I had the privilege of doing that several years ago, you would kind of see that some of disciple making is still very much like it was in Bible times. And so some Orthodox Jews kind of take a lot of those same principles, and they are able to make disciples of themselves. And so you have rabbis who are learning to see who might study underneath them. And so you have students, and here in today's world, if you were to travel to Israel and kind of do kind of a study on this, you have a disciple, or it's called a Talmud in Hebrew. A disciple would ask the rabbi if they can simply follow him. And so when a teenager, when a young person becomes of age, and so he's still learning within what it means to be a follower of Christ, he would seek out a rabbi, a teacher in the Jewish world, still happens today, and he would ask that rabbi, can I learn from you? Can you teach me what it means to be a follower of Jesus? And so the disciple, or again the Talmud, asks this rabbi, can I follow you? Can I follow you? Interesting details that Jesus flips the cultural norm as we are learning that Jesus actually is the one who does the choosing, right? So Jesus goes to these men as they're fishing and he says, hey, why don't you come follow me? In today's world, it's a little bit flipped in the Jewish world as they wait for others to come follow them. And so if you do a study on Orthodox Jews today, you study under your rabbi, you learn that as the rabbi mentors them and spends time with them, that a good Talmud or disciple begins to do everything their rabbi or teacher does, down to the point that they literally dress like their teacher. They dress like their rabbi. This is true. You can actually go there and see. And so if a rabbi wears a particular hat and it's a little cocked to the side, to the right, his followers actually mimic down to the dress, where they too will have a hat and it's a little bit cocked off to the right. And so they're learning to mimic every detail of their teacher. This is what it means to follow your rabbi. And so if you were a good follower, you would learn to do everything that your teacher does, to the point that you are dressing like them, wearing a hat like them. You begin to match even their speech. And so if they have a bit of a drawl in their speech, literally the disciples, the followers of these rabbis, begin to kind of talk like them in every aspect that they possibly can, because they want to follow closely the teachings of their rabbi. There was a saying, and you can still kind of research this today, that I want to follow so close to my rabbi that I want to be covered in the dust of my rabbi. And so as your rabbi is walking, your teacher is walking, as he kicks up dust, you're so close to mimicking his life that you too are picking up dust from his life, and you're becoming more and more like him. So how closely you were following your teacher was an indication of your seriousness as you are learning to follow him. And here in Acts chapter 4, these religious leaders were astonished as it was clear that Peter and John were following so closely to Jesus' life. You will see that he continues to spend more and more focused, intentional time with them. And he gets closer and closer to them. And as the time drew near for him to go to the cross, he actually began kind of a sort of a close-up kind of shop with his disciples as he continues to mentor them closer and closer. And eventually, he pulls away from the masses, and Jesus spends the rest of his waking time with his disciples, with those who he wanted to pour into. And this was intense time as he continues to mentor his 12. In John chapter 11, the context is surrounding really the plot to kill Jesus for claiming to be the Messiah, the Son of God. And as that time grew more and more near, here's what the Bible says in John chapter 11. So that day on, they made plans to put him to death. Jesus therefore no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples. And so Jesus kind of pulls into the bullseye. Remember the bullseye? It's kind of those close to it, and then 12, and then kind of the followers. He's now kind of zeroing in his focus to those who he wants to spend most of his time with, and he continues to disciple them. That's where we get the word, as he kind of mentors them privately here, his disciples. In John chapter 13 through 17, you can kind of flip here on your own sometime, and you can see has Jesus kind of zeroes in and kind of making his disciples. And so he's now spending some private mentoring time. He washes their feet in John chapter 13. He instructs them about love. He instructs them about the Holy Spirit and suffering and even persecution, kind of telling them that, hey, it's going to come. And he even prays for them in a beautiful way, but he doesn't just pray for them, but for the world that will hear through their ministry as a result of his mentoring relationship. And he pours himself out to each of them as he is making his disciples. And this leads us to the next pattern that Jesus gives us. And we see here in these chapters of John where he begins to not just mentor his disciples, but he also models his life for his disciples. And so we move from mentor to model. Remember, if mentor is kind of a trusted guide, therefore, a teacher or advisor who gives personal direction, encouragement, and wisdom, that's what a mentor is, then the definition of model is simply an example or pattern to imitate. It's giving someone a model so that you can imitate the pattern of their life. Even in John chapter 13, we just kind of referred to this. In Jesus' private mentoring ministry, he washes his disciples' feet. He models to them what he now wants them to also do for others. He closes that time with his disciples and he says, "You also should do these things." So when we come together for what we call our threefold communion, we actually partake in foot washing as well, because Jesus says you also ought to do these things. He's modeled these things to his disciples. He's modeled these things to ourselves, and it's a beautiful thing that we partake in together as an intimate time with our church family. And so he says, you should also do these things. In John chapter 13, he says, "For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you." So the second point is kind of a central theme here. It's really to model. Jesus didn't just command his disciples to do anything that he first didn't display or demonstrate before them. It's interesting here kind of to do some research how long Jesus had been with them, mentoring them, kind of pouring into their life, modeling to his disciples before he finally sends them out to preach in Matthew 10 and also in Luke 10. By most calculations, when you figure it out, Jesus had been with his disciples for about a year before he ever said, "Okay, now it's time for you now to go out." So they observed his life, they observed his ministry and his model for about a year, and then he sends them out to continue his mission. They've seen Jesus model his prayer life. They've seen Jesus model his rest life. They have watched him interact with the rich young ruler and the short man named Zacchaeus, who was a tax collector, who was a thief. They watched him interact with 10 lepers that he healed, the money changers in the temple, a 12-year-old daughter of Jairus who died. Interestingly enough, when he healed Jairus, he only asked 3 disciples to be in on that close encounter as he worked a miracle, right, to bring Jairus' daughter back to life. And so this was discipleship on the go. And so Jesus is continuing to kind of pour into their life more and more, watching them grow, preparing them to now say, "Okay, it's time. Now you go and you make disciples." And so he moves from this mentor to model. He's modeling his life to them to now multiply. Finally, Jesus' pattern is now multiplication. The things that I've done to you, I want you now to go and do these things. And he expected his disciples to now go and reproduce other disciples. I poured into your life. Now this is the goal, is for you now to go and pour into others' life. And this is the ultimate test, because if Jesus' disciples didn't multiply, then the whole thing would be a failure. But they did. They did what Jesus had called them to do, because the Holy Spirit, by the way, will guarantee that this multiplication is going to happen. And so it has been multiplying ever since, to the point that someone came close to you and introduced you to Jesus Christ. Now you and I have a role to come close to someone else and to teach them and help them grow in their faith in Jesus Christ. And so these 12 disciples that Jesus poured into their life, you could say, radically changed the world. And the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ has multiplied to this day, to the point that someone also shared the good news of Jesus with you. Right? Who was that person for you? For me, it was my mom. I can remember I was just about 6 years of age, 7 years, or almost 7 years of age. And I can remember, I don't know why, I think God gives you that ability to remember the day well. And so I don't remember much of those earlier years except from stories that others have told me, right? But that one I remember. I can picture what I was doing at the time when my mom was making my sister's bed, and I happened to be just kind of in my sister's room playing with Matchbox cars. I remember that little detail. Don't remember much of my life other than that, but I can remember in that interaction some things kind of happened naturally in a conversation, and my mom led me to the throne room of Jesus Christ. I'll never forget that moment, and I think God gives you that ability to never forget that tick line on your map, right, or on your timeline. And so from that moment on, my parents began to pour into my life what it means to follow Jesus, taking me to church, introducing me to youth pastors who continued to pour into my life. My brother-in-law was one of my youth pastors who poured into my life to help me learn more and more about who Jesus is, to the point now that I'm coming alongside other people, helping them to understand who Jesus is. And so this is the pattern of discipleship that we will see that Jesus has laid out before us. And next week, we're going to study another person's life, kind of as a case study, to see how they imitated Christ as they became disciple makers. And I think his example is the greatest example that we have within the Bible, other than Jesus himself. And I'll let you guess who that is. And then next week, we will study his life. I'm going to ask Pastor Mark to kind of come up to us, something that we want to do, and he's going to kind of come up and kind of close our time with a time of reflection as we're kind of continuing to challenge ourselves in the area of discipleship. And so here Mark will come as we reflect.
Before they're selected. It says up in Luke 6, starting in verse 12, it says, in those days he went up to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when the day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, through whom he named apostles. And then he lists the names of those there. And so as we think about discipleship, one of the things that we want to do is we want to be praying about maybe who it is that God would have us help influence, to mentor. We kind of said this morning that discipleship is God's way of advancing his mission through mentoring, modeling, and multiplying. We'll continue to look through that over the coming weeks, but we want to give you a little bit of chance to pray this morning. We kind of did this with our rescue series. We want to give you a chance to reflect this morning. We have two kind of prayer prompts that we're going to go through. I'll just give you about a minute to pray for each of those as you begin to think about how you may apply this to your life in the coming weeks. And so I'll give you a moment, and then I'll come back up and close us here in just a moment. stepped into our lives to help disciple us, help to model for us what it looks like to follow Jesus. God, we thank you for how they were intentional about maybe using their influence to help point us towards you, to help shape us and mold us. So God, we pray that you would help us to be faithful as we look to do that maybe in the lives of others. God, as you prayed for those 12 that you chose, we ask that you would help guide us in who it is that you would maybe have us pair up with. Maybe that's not a relationship that maybe makes sense to us, but there's something that you want to do through that person, or maybe even in and through us, in that to help us grow, to help them grow, to help each of us mature in Christ's likeness. God, we pray that you would help us continue this pattern of faithful discipleship that was modeled to us. And maybe if it wasn't, God, it can start with us today. That doesn't have to be something that catches us up. But you can help us to start a new pattern of that in our own lives, we pray. God, help us as we look to continue to advance your mission through the means that you've given us. Help us to step in our lives, to mentor for others. Help us to be good role models. Help us to continue to be faithful to you, that we may multiply those who love and follow Jesus, we pray. In his name we ask these things. Amen. Thank you so much for worshiping with us this morning. If you have your Connect card with some of those signups, if you could just turn that into the worship or the welcome center as you go out, that would be great. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you here again next Sunday.